He was there, standing in the corner of my room. A luminous silhouette that seemed to breathe between worlds while I trembled with fear and a strange quiet awe. He told me he could turn my traumas into weapons, my fears into tools of power. Want to know how I traded 5 decades of failure for a life where every scar became a portal to abundance? I asked myself as I looked out from the window of my new apartment, the city lights like a crowd of quiet witnesses. I thought of the being who changed everything, and the question that followed me into sleep. I was 53. I remember that number like a weight in my pocket. I am Richard Torres, and before that night my life wore a tired face, sleepless hours, cups of coffee gone cold, envelopes spread over the little table in my studio like flags of concession. Work had been a patchwork for 30 years, short contracts, promises that frayed, a few months of stability swallowed by a layoff. Relationships folded like paper boats in a rainstorm. I woke with my heart rushing, as if the day began already late. The light in my room was thin. Morning smelled of dust and last night's tea. I could feel the clock through the air. It ticked at me short, almost cruel beats. Tick, tack. The sound sat heavy in my chest like a small animal. I learned to stop dreaming aloud. Wishes were expensive. They cost hope, and hope had been taxed to nothing. Banks measured me in columns and boxes. The last manager looked at my file and said the facts, flat as concrete. "It's simple math, Mr. Torres," he said. His voice had the texture of ledger paper. "Your age, your income, this financing is not viable." He smiled the way a bridge smiles at a river it will never cross. I saved. I counted every coin like a soldier counts breaths. But life kept happening. A tooth that broke and needed fixing. My mother's funeral that emptied the small savings I had gathered with trembling hands. A sudden firing that came without warning and left a blank where salary used to be. Each emergency was a hand in my pocket. Each emergency a small theft. The pile of bills grew like a slow mold. At night, I would stand on the tiny balcony and let the city breathe on me. Across the way, a new building rose, glass bright and stubborn. I imagined myself inside it, older furniture, a shelf for books I never finished, a kitchen that did not feel like a borrowed room. The balcony felt too small for those dreams. The wind smelled like oil and rain. My chest tightened. I learned to hold that pressure like an old friend, to live with it. My hands were restless. They always found something to do, folding paper, crumpling a receipt, anything to quiet the noise inside my skull. I started speaking to the dark. Not formal prayers, not polished litany. Just a low murmur from the place in me that still believed the world might be listening. "Help me," I said, sometimes like a question, sometimes like a dare. I spoke the words like a man testing a bridge with one foot. Several nights I slept poorly after that. I woke with the taste of metal at the back of my tongue, as if fear had teeth. The smallest things began to feel like signs. A misplaced shoe returned to its pair. An old neighbor waved at me with a look that felt almost like recognition. I tried to be careful with my hope. It was fragile, and I was afraid of breaking it for good. There was also this quiet, growing curiosity, like the low hum you feel in a room right before a piano begins to play. I did not know if the hum was coming from me or from somewhere else. I remember the texture of my nights, the TV light painting the ceiling a tired blue, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant sirens like sea animals. My breath often came short. I would lie awake and replay the worst days as if practicing a speech I never wanted to give. Shame tasted like vinegar. The day of my eviction lived in my chest like a replay of a film I could not stop. The truck, the neighbors watching, the way my hands shook when I carried the last box down the stairwell. Humiliation is loud. It shouts. It makes the world small and sharp. I became a collector of rejections, lone refusals, doors that closed before I could knock, the polite, final tone of no from records and forms. Each one built a pattern in me. I was someone who did not belong to houses, who did not own space, who was always on the margin of security. I began to believe my worth in numbers, an account balance, a credit score, a refusal letter. Those numbers grew teeth. Between the bills and the sleep, something else started. Small coincidences that did not feel like chance. I would think of a simple thing, and the next day, I would see it: a book at a used stand, the exact sandwich I wanted at the diner, a coin on the sidewalk when I was counting my steps. I started noting these as if they were seeds poking through hard soil. Perhaps the world was answering in gestures too small to be called miracles. When the answering came in the form of a voice and light, I was half asleep. The house smelled of night and lemon cleaner. I woke to a sound, not quite a buzz, not quite a song. It had rhythm, like someone tapping a secret code on the glass. It filled the room and made the curtains move as if someone outside were walking around with a lantern. My chest felt a pressure like the deep before a storm. Then the air changed. It thickened, and with that thickness came a brightness that did not come from any bulb. Light pooled in the corner by the bookcase, and then slowly, like frost forming, a shape grew. Not solid, not flesh. A human silhouette braided from light itself, moving as if through water. Its eyes were black, deep with pinpricks of light that looked like galaxies caught in oil. I did not scream. There was a calm that arrived like rain after too much sun. My body, strangely, listened. The being spoke not with air, but with a resonance inside my head. It named no language I knew, but a single sound unrolled inside me and settled. In my mind it sounded like Ezekiel. The word felt older than my language and softer than a door that opens. "Your wounds are portals," he said. The words were not loud, but they came like a tide that rearranged stones. "What you call trauma, I call unused fuel." I swallowed. The room smelled suddenly of bread baking, of my mother's kitchen, of safety I had not allowed myself to remember. How did you find me?" My voice was a thin thing. Ezekiel moved like liquid light. He flowed around the lamp, then through it. "You called," he answered simply. "Not in speech, but in frequency. Need has a sound. Fear broadcasts. Signals are compasses." When he reached toward me, the air cooled and stretched. The seconds seemed to melt. He placed, if it was a touch at all, something like a palm on my forehead. The pressure was not painful. It was the same feeling you get when you read the last line of a long letter and understand all that it did not say. "What paralyzes you now will free you later," he whispered, and then, softer still, "We will witness this together." I did not sleep after that night, but I did not toss and turn with panic. Instead, I lay awake and listened to the small sounds of the room, as if they had tips and tails, now messages waiting to be read. I felt an observation in my chest, like the muscles had learned to watch. I told no one. Who would I say it to? A creature of light that named my wounds as doors. My friend Edward would laugh and hand me a card for a psychiatrist. He would clean his glasses with 2 fingers and say, "You're under stress, Richard." I pictured his suit, the neatness of his hairline. I imagined the tilt of his head and the worry in his eyes, like a man watching someone step too close to the edge. But there was also a small, stubborn flame in me, a part that had never believed fully in himself. Yes, but still kept whispering that maybe the world had rules we had not yet learned to spell. I could feel curiosity rising like heat from wet pavement. It carried its own risk. I knew I was at a choice point. I could let the hum settle back into the silence I had made my home, or I could follow it. My palms itched. My breath slowed when I imagined surrender. There was fear deep and ancient, the fear of being called mad. There was also hunger. Hunger is honest. It does not pretend to be anything but appetite. That hunger pushed me. I listened for the next sign. Mini cliffhanger. There would be a test, a small thing to measure what this light could actually do, and what came next would begin to tip the balance between doubt and proof. A small note before I go on. If you've stayed this far, thank you. This channel is new and fragile, like a window in a winter house. If this story reaches you, tell me where you are, city, country, in the comments. It helps us find each other, and it helps the story to breathe. Loop affirmation. One of the new cycles I learned, the skin of him was not skin. It was light that breathed. He exhaled a soft tone, and in my mind a word settled that wore the shape of Ezekiel. Your wounds are portals, he said, and his voice sank into me like a stone into calm water. You call them traumas. They are fuel. I remember the rawness when he said that. The air tasted like metal and citrus. I touched the blanket and it felt like paper in my fingers, thin, sensible, real, but my hands did not shake. There was a curious peace in the face of the impossible. It was as if an old part of me had recognized something it had been missing. How did you find me? I asked, the question like a child's, foolish and honest. You called, Ezekiel replied. Not with words. With frequency. Need is a signal. Fear is a beacon. He made a motion, a gesture that felt like a hand moving through water, and the room rearranged. Shadows deepened, then softened. The overhead light shifted color, a slow gradient bathing the ceiling in blue. For a second, the refrigerator hummed in time with that rhythm. Then a glass on my bedside table began to tremble in perfect circles. Your words are not merely sounds, Ezekiel said. They are commands of creation. I watched the water in the glass. The circles rose along the inner wall and then settled without spilling. My rational mind reached for explanations, air currents, coincidence, but another part of me only watched, emptied of immediate judgment. I felt a childlike awe, the kind you feel before the sea for the first time. Show me, I said. I could feel the tremor in the syllables. Not a demand, a plea. Ezekiel did not speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice was soft and precise. We will not trick you. We will translate, but you must participate honestly. He guided me then, in a manner that was both tender and efficient. He told me to choose something small, a thing I wanted but did not need. He asked me to access the deepest pain tied to that desire, to let the memory wash through me like cold water, to feel every jag of shame and fear. I obeyed, because curiosity had become a kind of courage. I let my mind travel back to the eviction. I could see the truck, the neighbors, the way my hands had trembled carrying the last box. The shame landed like a weight on my chest. I breathed into it. I let the shame be dense, like wet clay, heavy and cohesive. Ezekiel's presence was steady, like shore underwater. Do not resist, he said. Go all the way in. The edge is where the work happens. So I did. I let myself sink into the scene, and, for a moment, the shame cut like a winter wind. I felt my lungs tighten. I cried until my face was wet. The scent of dust and old cardboard filled my nose. When the memory reached its most raw point, Ezekiel's voice folded into me and asked me to name what the pain had taught me. Through sobs I said, I survived. I can rebuild. Say that again, he told me, and there was a note in the silence after his words, a kind of space to breathe into. I survived, I said louder now. I rebuilt myself. I can begin again. It was small, but it felt like a key turning. Ezekiel smiled, or the light around him arranged into a pattern that read like a smile, and he asked me to imagine the item I wanted. A small vintage coffee maker, the exact model my grandmother had used. He told me not to wish, but to hold it as if it already sat on my counter, to feel the certainty like a heat in the center of the chest. I practiced what he taught. Breath slow, a sensation of warmth in the sternum, the phrase spoken internally, I am allowed to receive. I am permitted to keep. The words felt bizarre and sacramental at once. The next morning, 3 days later, I wandered down a street I rarely took, and a thrift store had that very machine in the window, dusty and perfect, with a price tag that felt like a joke. I bought it for 10 reis. The woman behind the counter said, it was donated last night. I went home and felt something settle deep in my ribcage. The machine was a simple object, but my hands shook when I touched it. It was proof, stupid and sweet, and its smallness was exactly what I needed. I did not shout it from rooftops. I told no one. I could hear Edward in my head, his laugh sharp and caring and terrified for me. Richard, he would say, get help. I pictured his face, the lines near his eyes, the way he folded his hands. I did not want to lose him or be the subject of a sympathy story in a lunchroom. But the experiment had a different effect. It opened a door and did not close. Each small success made the hum in me louder. I kept notes, little observations about mood and coincidences, the tempo of my days. The world began returning answers in ways that were measurable and yet not owned by statistics. It felt like learning a language that only revealed itself when you dared to use it. Ezekiel taught me to go deeper, not to ignore the pain, but to translate it. Turn the wound into a channel, he said. The channel will carry your signal. Clean it, and it becomes a bridge. He showed me, once, a pattern of red fog around my chest when I was angry and constricted. He called them my rejection coils. He pointed and said, "This pushes away. This must be rewritten." He never lectured. His words were short, precise, poetic. He asked me to feel, not to theorize. He invited me to do the work in small rites. A breath, a naming, a visual certainty held for 3 minutes. Each ritual was a lab exercise. Each exercise produced small signals, an email, a returned call, the right person in the right place. It was not magic as in fireworks. It was a steady, cumulative weather. Along the way, I developed a personal set of short loops, affirmations that fit into pockets of silence during the day. They were simple and repeatedly used. I am builder, not victim. I open, I receive. I transmute my past into fuel. I would say one quietly while washing the dishes, another while waiting in line. They were anchors that called my body back into posture, into a stance that assumed possibility. The loops were not promises. They were rehearsals for a new habit of being. Of course, there was resistance. People noticed changes and questions followed. My colleague Christina drew away when I spoke about the practice. Her face folded into concern and disbelief. "Don't lose yourself," she warned. I could hear the fear behind her words, the societal fear of stepping outside common reality into something that looked, to them, like fantasy. Edward finally asked me outright, "Are you certain it's healthy?" He wanted me to be safe, and in his doubt, there was love. I told him what I could, the parts that would not make him worry, and I watched the trust wobble between us. We moved carefully. I knew that some doors close when you step through them. Relationships are part of that cost. Ezekiel was patient. He would shine with small bursts, brighter when I was stubborn, softer when I was scared. He never demanded faith. He taught me methods, sensory prep, breath, naming the lesson in the pain, imagining the item already present, and then moving through the day with the certainty as a quiet actor behind my shoulders. He used metaphors like a carpenter uses tools. Your past is timber. If you measure it with care, you can build a home. One morning, after a long cycle of practice, I woke with a warmth that pulsed from the center of my chest. It felt like a furnace had been lit. I followed the sensation and walked into a building I had never entered. The leasing agent, Sophia, met me with a smile I could not explain. "We just had a cancellation," she told me. "There's a unit available, with special terms, if you're interested." The price was almost exactly the amount I had managed to set as feasible. There was a small gap, a 200 real difference, and my hands did not tremble when I signed. For the first time in my life, I felt deserving as a posture, not a hope. 30 days later, they handed me the keys. I stood in the doorway of my apartment and let the city air spill in. It smelled like tile and new paint. For a long second, I was only a man and a door and a set of rooms that would learn my shape. Mini cliffhanger. The work that made the apartment possible was not a single miracle, but a sequence, some of which I had yet to fully understand. The next part of the process promised a map, a code of creation that would make the method repeatable, and that was the true gift I had not expected. Loop affirmation, variation 2, I transmute, I build, I belong. The room rearranged itself around a new fact. There was a language I had never been taught, and it answered to the weight of my feeling. Ezekiel did not hand me a book. He handed me a pair of eyes that could see the weave behind things. The light that made Ezekiel let moments play like notes on a small piano. Each memory produced a visible response, a ripple, a flash, a tightening. Every belief makes a shape, he said. The sound did not echo. It translated. Shapes attract their kin. I watched a coin on my bedside table vibrate. Not coin exactly, the light that hid in the metal reacted. It leaned away when I pictured scarcity. It softened when I held a picture in my mind of a kitchen that smelled of coffee and safety. My rational brain supplied hypotheses, coincidence, trick of light, fatigue. But the part of me that had spent decades waiting for nothing to happen took notes like a scientist suddenly invited into the lab. Ezekiel taught me how to read the room. He asked me to sit very still and to map one internal phrase to one external image. He called the process attunement. The ritual was simple. Slow the breath, anchor the feet to the floor, name the memory in 2 words, watch the room. For example, eviction shame. The red fog coiled tighter. Father's words, unworthiness. A small shadow at the corner of the lamp shuddered. He never used long speeches. His sentences were short, precise like a jeweler tapping a stone. You have been talking to absence as if it were a guarantor, he said once. Ask differently. So I asked differently. I sat at the edge of my bed, the mattress springs announcing each small shift. I inhaled like someone filling a bell, held the breath, and then exhaled into the phrase, I deserve a home. The words felt clumsy in my mouth. They went against a lifetime of shrunken posture. The red fog trembled. For a sliver of time, the windows in my apartment looked farther away, as if the whole building had taken a step back. A glass on the nightstand trembled in concentric rings, small circles that climbed up the glass and then stopped. The sound was faint. The vibration was real. I set my hand nearby and felt the air hum, a pressure on the skin like an insect's wings. That small, sensible phenomenon had an implication that struck me like cold water. Belief was not private. It was weather, not magic. Ezekiel said when I named the impossibility. Mechanism. You will learn to clean channels, not conjure gifts. He guided me to a simple 4-step practice that night, and I followed. Preparation. I shut off the fan, found the space where the light fell soft, tasted the air. Action. I named the wound and the resulting phrase, I rebuild, breathed into it, and held an image like a prop in my chest. Effect. The lamp's shade tilted ever so slightly toward me. A loose hair on my arm rose. Reflection. I wrote one line in a notebook. The room answered when I stopped apologizing. The first revelation was not the appliance in the thrift store or the trembling glass. It was the knowledge that my inner script left tracks in the outer world. My shame had been a geography. My longing had been a map. And maps, when read, can be altered. That night, under the pale cone of the lamp, Ezekiel drew me another image. He took the phrase I could not disentangle, not enough, and shaped it into a tool, a narrow channel, like a pipe clogged with sediment. Clean it, he said. Let what is yours pass. I touched my chest. The skin felt like a drum. The sensation was small and precise. Warmth spreading beneath the sternum, like the first safe sip of tea on a winter morning. I learned how to be very slow with myself, to watch for micro movements. The practice did not ask me to stop feeling. It asked me to hold the feeling and then to name what it would transmute into. Mini cliffhanger. I would test the channel. The test would be simple. If it worked, the world would give me a pulse I could count. Loop affirmation. Knew I claim my space. I make room. I let goodness pass. Ezekiel asked for something small. He wanted a proof that did not require faith, only honesty. The request felt almost tender in its practicality. He told me to choose an object that lived on the edge of my wanting, not a car, not a mortgage, something intimate and ordinary. I chose the old coffee maker that had burned 1,000 breakfasts in my grandmother's kitchen. The metal had the ghost of her hands in it. I had been looking for it for weeks. Preparation. I sat on the thin rug. The radiator hissed. The light outside was the color of old photos. I breathed with my hands cupped around the feeling in my chest, like someone warming coins. I set a timer for 5 minutes. Feel the wound, Ezekiel said. Let shame be full. Action. I brought the eviction into the room like a slow film. I smelled damp cardboard. I felt the truck's metal under my palms. I let every neighbor's glance burn into me. I stayed there until the emotion had density. My nose stung. My vision narrowed. I kept my mouth soft. Effect. When the pain was full, I spoke not a wish of fact. I survived that. I rebuilt that. I can begin again. The words were not bravado. They sounded like implements, practical, shaped. The red fog around my chest thinned. The air in the room moved as if someone had opened a small vent. Reflection. I held the image of the coffee maker in the same posture I used for the pain. I did not ask. I assumed. I held certainty like a small stone between ribs. It felt ridiculous. It felt steady. 3 days later, I walked past a street I rarely used. The sun had a frail generosity. A shop window caught my eye. Inside, under a salute of dust and cobweb, sat the exact coffee maker. The tag said 10 reis. The woman behind the counter smiled like sunlight. It was donated last night, she said. Her voice had the texture of ordinary mercy. That coincidence was more than coincidence. It was a proof of pattern. I carried the coffee maker like contraband joy. It smelled faintly of coffee and lemon. When I plugged it in at home, the sound it made felt like a small applause. My hands shook as they held the pot, and the shaking felt different. It was not fear. It was recognition. Ezekiel taught me to scale the experiment. Small evidence accumulates. It organizes days. He taught me to make micro-rituals that any person could do without an altar. They were almost absurd in their gentleness. Prepare the body, honor the wound, state the truth, hold the image. Let the day proceed with the posture of a person who expects doors to open. He also taught me what not to do. Do not weaponize desperation. Do not perform certainty for an audience. The field responds to authenticity, he said, not to theater. His voice was like a window cleaning itself. At work, the change was subtle. I stopped shrinking at the desk. I straightened the papers. People noticed my posture before they noticed my results. A client returned a call I had given up on. A neighbor returned a favor. Small synchronies threaded like beads on a string. I began to catalog them, not to boast, but to learn the grammar. Not everyone celebrated. Eduardo saw me, eyes narrowed, and offered a pamphlet of worry disguised as care. You need to see a doctor, he said. His voice vibrated with affection and fear. He worried the way someone worries who wants to save another from a cliff by force. Christina at work pulled away. Her skepticism made her polite distance become a seriousness. We live in shared realities, she said without saying it, and yours seems to be shifting. The social friction was a new variable. It forced me to hold my inner experiments more private. To some degree, that secrecy saved me. The practice demanded that the field be cultivated, not explained. Ezekiel's guidance was deliberate. Do the work. Let the world react. Let your life be the argument. So I doubled down on the method. 3 nights of practice, not because I sought a miracle, but because I wanted to learn the craft. Each night, I walked the memories of my childhood homes, the boxes, the goodbyes, the teachers' faces, and I let them become materials in my hands. I called them planks and nails and learned to measure. I practiced breath, slow in 4 counts, hold for 3, release for 5. I practiced posture, chest open, shoulders soft, feet grounded. I practiced declaration, small sentences in the present tense, like I am allowed to receive, I keep what sustains me. The sentences were not prayers, they were calibrations. Effect. The small miracles did not all announce themselves with trumpets. A phone call from a past contractor arrived with 2 extra days of work. A long silent cousin sent a note asking if I could help with photographs, a paid job that fit the week like a puzzle piece. Each event was ordinary. Each event felt like a confirmation the field had teeth. Reflection. The practice taught me to be patient with the rate of return. The technology of intent was not a speculative lottery. It was a discipline. I had to be precise. My hands, once so restless, lay in my lap. I weighed the cost. To follow this path was to accept losses of explanation, of certain friendships, of being easily understood. To keep silent about Ezekiel felt like betrayal. To speak felt like risking ridicule. Ezekiel watched me. He did not chastise. He brightened slightly, and then dimmed. You will be tested by those who hold the old ledger, he said. They will read your change as error. Let them. Each life has its rules. He showed me an image, a workshop where a craftsman exchanges old nails for new ones. He said, the market of belonging demands price. Decide what nails you will keep. The decision was a practical one. I would not lie about what I experienced, but I would choose when and how to disclose it. I practiced phrases that were true yet protective. I found practices that helped me show up differently, or I learned tools to convert old wounds into work. These lines were softer than alien mentor, and they kept the partnership intact in the world of people who counted with spreadsheets and polite concern. Resistance also took a different form: internal friction. Old doubt crept back like fog. There were nights I felt ridiculous, a man rehearsing rituals like a child who has read a magic book. The body remembered patterns of failure and tried to realign me with familiar safety. Smaller steps, less risk, cheaper dreams. I named that inner voice the accountant and gave it 3 minutes each morning to speak. Then I shut the door and went to work. Ezekiel taught me a technique for handling social friction, translated into data. He asked me to observe the timing of comments, the tone, the content, like a scientist collecting samples, not a gladiator reading affronts. This made reactions intelligible rather than personal. If a friend recoiled, I saw the recoil as their map, not my measure. At the same time, the practice kept producing evidence. A neighbor I had barely spoken to offered to help paint my entryway. A client who had ghosted me for months returned with a small project and an apology. Money did not rain down in torrents. It arrived in steps: invoices paid, overdue amounts reduced, a surprise voucher for a repair I had needed. Each practical relief eased the pressure around my chest a degree. Ezekiel never promised a painless path. Integration asks for trading, he said. You give up the story of victim to gain the tools of a builder. That phrase settled into me like a nail into wood. I felt both loss and advancement. The world reshaped slowly to the work I did on my inner channels. I tested a harder boundary. Eduardo had suggested a psychiatrist out of love and fear. I told him I would consider it, but I asked him to trust me. He did not, at first. The space between us widened. I called him one night and did something I had not done before. I placed the coffee maker between my hands and told him, simply, what had happened. I did not insist he believe. I only asked him to witness the small, ordinary miracles and to note the change in my posture. He listened. The lines on his face softened. He did not completely understand. He admitted that he feared for me. He promised to watch. The conversation did not restore everything, but it made room. Resistance also revealed who and what would not travel with me. A few acquaintances dissolved into polite distance. One colleague who had once shared lunches with me began to avoid eye contact. Each departure hurt, yes, but it also clarified. My circle narrowed to those who could tolerate uncertainty and those who responded with curiosity rather than judgment. Ezekiel's presence was a buffer. When the doubts gathered like clouds, he taught me a breathing pattern and a phrase to state silently. I transmute what weighs me down. Say it while your feet feel the ground. Say it when someone names your path as error. The phrase was not a spell. It was a posture. It made my voice settle in my chest, so I did not tilt with every gust. One evening, after a particularly sharp exchange with a neighbor about noise, a trivial quarrel that triggered an old, disproportionate shame, I went back inside and sat on the floor holding the blue crystal he had left. Its light was faint, a polite pulse. I took the ritual we had practiced. I called the eviction to the room, as before, let it burn, and then I turned the memory's energy into a plan, 2 budgets, a contingency list, a schedule for small savings. The trauma transformed into work. The work created signals the world could read. Mini cliffhanger. The next test would not be social. It would be structural. The practices had to scale. I would have to use all I had learned to move an impossible sum in a formal decision. The stakes would be not just belonging, but legal commitment. Loop affirmation, knew I stand my ground. I transmute what is broken. I build the life I claim. The work changed when the stakes became written on paper. Until then, it had been breath and posture, memory and small proofs. Then Sophia slid the contract across a lacquered table, and the world asked for signatures. I woke that morning with the radiator coughing and a cold ring at the base of my skull. The apartment above mine stomped like a herd. I sat on the kitchen chair, palms on my knees. I breathed in 4 counts, held 3, out 5. The ritual I had practiced 100 times condensed into a single available motion. Prepare the body. Honor the wound. State the truth. Hold the image. I repeated the sentence Ezekiel had given me in a whisper. I am not asking for mercy. I am knocking with my work. The day moved like a slow train. I walked the block with my wallet careful in my pocket and the memory of the eviction like a stone in my breast pocket. At the sales office, the air smelled of new paint and coffee. Sophia's smile arrived first, then the news. A buyer had pulled out the day before. A release clause, a renegotiation clause, a bank willing to stretch if the down payment arrived in the next 48 hours. Her eyes measured me the way a craftsman measures would not pity, only fit. I felt the old pulse of panic, the one that says you are about to lose more than you can replace. It rose like heat behind my ears. I named it aloud in the stairwell. This is fear. This is not a law. I let it speak for 3 minutes, and then closed the door. Ezekiel had taught me to turn fear into ledger entries. I wrote 2 budgets on a napkin, one conservative, one with room for surprise. I called the cousin who owed me a favor and asked him to postpone a payment. He did. I sold the small camera I rarely used and called the bank to explain a situation they could either close or bend. I did not perform certainty for an audience. I documented it. When the banker asked for additional proof of income, I offered a plan. I described the freelance photography job that could be billed in 2 weeks. The banker countered with skepticism. I did not argue. I showed the invoice drafts, the messages confirming the job, the neighbor's offer to help move in for a weekend in exchange for a meal. Practical artifacts. The man looked at the folder and then at me. The air between us was the size of a hinge. At noon, I signed the initial documents. My hand trembled. My mouth stayed soft. I read every clause like a person reading the underside of a bridge, looking for defects. The signature landed in ink. The desk returned the pen. The world required commitment. I supplied it. The test, the structural part, was not only money. It was also bureaucracy. A clause in the contract required a formal guarantor. I called Eduardo. I had rehearsed 1,000 reasons not to. Our friendship had strained. He answered on the 3rd ring. I told him plainly what I was asking. To co-sign a guarantee for a short, defined period, with every legal protection in writing. His breath was a long shadow. There was a silence that felt like an hour. He asked for time. I gave him 3 days, and then asked him to listen one evening, with the coffee maker between our hands. He came. We sat in the thin light. I told him, without the show of Ezekiel and without asking belief, what had been happening. I described the practices in terms he trusted: habit change, focused grief work, evidence collection. I showed him the budgets, the lists, the bank exchanges. He touched the crystal on my table, a polite gesture, then the napkin with my 3 budgets. He did not agree to be a guarantor immediately. He promised to watch. The last day was a test of edges. The developer called with suddenly renewed interest from another buyer. It could have turned fast. I did what I had practiced. Feet grounded, chest open, voice calm. I repeated a short sentence. not as mantra, but as a legal posture. I steward what I claim. The developer gave me the window I asked for. Sophia and I moved the paperwork. The signature. Ezekiel returned on the first night. I slept with boxes around me. He was quieter, as if the air itself had learned to lower its voice. The light bent differently now. It pooled in the corners like a patient animal. He did not lecture. He moved his hand, or the idea of a hand, and the shadow on the wall folded like paper. "You did not summon me to do your work," he said, syllables slow and clear inside my head. "You called to remember your instrument." I felt the floor under my palms. The wood was slightly damp from the mover's boots. My breathing was shallow. He made a simple motion and the dampness felt like data, a hint about insulation, about timing, about things that require human attention. His presence taught me to map inner states to outer tasks. He named the pattern. "Trauma is brown wood," he said. "It can rot or it can be a beam. Your job is the joinery." The metaphor landed as an instruction, practical and oddly tender. He showed me the code of creation not as proclamation, but as method. He laid out a small series of acts I could do daily, acts that translated inner calibration into outward leverage. They were not spells. They were verbs. 1. Begin with the wound, not to live there, but to extract the lesson. Sit with the memory until it speaks a precise sentence. Write that sentence as a plan item. Example, from the eviction I extract, build a 3-month liquidity buffer. The sentence becomes a work order. 2. Name the friction as data. When a friend recoils, note the timing, the words, the tone. Record it in a small notebook. Patterns are not accusations. They are templates the world uses. 3. State a short declarative sentence in present tense while the body holds the posture. Feet rooted, chest open, voice low. Example, I steward incoming resources. Say it once in the morning, once before signing documents, once before sleep. 4. Make small, honest tests every week. Pick an item under the budget line and shift it by a measurable amount. Witness the response. Record the result. Adjust. He made strange, concise observations between these steps. You do not need to believe me. You need to measure, he said. Faith is sloppy. Measurement is craft. I asked about ethics. He replied, and his voice became a window cleaned by a cloth. Do not weaponize lack as demand. Do not pretend certainty for applause. The field answers to integrity, not theater. He taught me language I could use with people and banks in my own chest. It was a set of sentences that functioned like tools. They were speech with handles. He left me a simple ritual to anchor the day. Morning breath, 3-minute reclaim of a wound, 1 sentence of plan, 1 small measurable action. He called it a habitus, a habit turned into craft. I practiced it for 7 mornings in a row. The first morning my neighbor knocked and offered to fix the door frame for the price of coffee. The third morning an overdue invoice arrived in my inbox and was paid in full. These were not fireworks. They were nails. He described a principle I later called the code of creation. When inner truth is converted into public action, the world has something to hold. Belief without body yields gossip. Body without honesty yields collapse. The unity of internal calibration and external craft becomes a readable signal for others and for systems. He showed me how to talk to people without the alien story. To Eduardo, I would say, I have new practices that help me manage grief and money. To the bank, I would show budgets and payment plans and a track record of small tests. To myself, I would say, I am the work and the witness. When he dimmed, the apartment was softer. A blue glass piece of nothing sat on my table like a punctuation mark. He left me with one command, short as a nail, steward what arrives, as if the arrival were fragile. Mini cliffhanger. He would go, but not without asking me to practice without the aura of spectacle. The real test would be sustaining the code when no light watched me. Loop affirmation. Knew I translate pain into plan. I speak with my hands. I steward what arrives. The morning after Ezekiel dissolved, The crystal on my table looked ordinary. It caught the light and threw a small, blue coin onto the floor. I picked it up and felt the history of the room, the eviction, the nights, the budget settle like dust. Weeks stretched into months. I made the ritual small and daily. Morning breath. One wound, one sentence, one measurable act. The routines were simple. 2 automatic transfers to a savings envelope. 1 hour a week cataloging small proofs. 1 conversation a month with someone who could be a guarantor or a client. The crystal became a fidget for my thumbs, an anchor when I doubted. Change crept in with the pace of permits. An overdue client returned with a paid, steady project. A neighbor I hardly knew offered to help plant a balcony garden in exchange for me teaching a basic photo skill. I took a small job to photograph an event, and it turned into a repeating contract. Money did not rain down. It arrived as regular hums. Invoices paid, debts realigned, 2 small promotions inside my company that combined into a healthy race. Each arrival felt like a bell I had learned to ring by building the clapper. People changed around me. Eduardo softened into a companion of caution and curiosity. He began asking, not to rescind his skepticism, but to understand the system I was using. We ate stale bread and drank sweet coffee. He admitted one evening between the steam of our cups that he had seen my posture change. "You look like someone who makes plans," he said, and the sentence was a gift. Not everyone traveled with me. Christina kept distance. Some friends vanished like summer shadows. That loss stung, yes, but the perimeter clarified itself. I had more room to build, fewer people trying to hold me down to old charts. Responsibility became a constant phrase in my mind. This technique was not a cure for life. It was a method that required sobriety. I never promised miracles to others. I placed a caution on my lips when people asked if they should follow. I said, measure, do the practice. Keep counsel with a professional when suffering is medical. The work is craft, not a replacement for care. I began to use what I had learned in small acts for others. A cousin who had been jobless for months asked me to look at his CV like a designer. I taught him the short ritual: name the wound, extract 1 sentence, build 1 micro step. He found a temporal in 2 weeks. A neighbor facing a small debt asked if I could help set a simple budget. We sat on my balcony with cheap tea and 2 pens. We turned grief into a timeline and then into actions. He paid back a late notice. These were proofs that the method was not vanity. Months after the keys, I placed the crystal in a small wooden box and gave it a name in my head: the transmitter. It did not glow. It did not answer. But when I doubted, I held it. The act realigned me. The ritual was my witness. Ezekiel's absence became a presence of a different tone. There were moments when I thought I saw his shape in the wash of evening light. But I stopped waiting for luminescence. I started to look for signs: a return call at the right hour, a contractor who honored a price, a neighbor who kept a promise. Signs were not miracles. They were calibrated responses to change. One night Eduardo and I sat on the stairwell. He was quieter than usual. He admitted he had feared I would become a stranger. I told him I was still myself, but more engineered. I had traded stories of victim for circuits of practice. He nodded. He did not become my champion, but he offered something better: ongoing tolerance. The last gift he left before he dissolved into the world of ordinary light was a phrase he had said when the keys became real: "You built the proof in public and in ledger." I held that sentence like wood glue. I understood then that my work might look like sorcery to some and like accountability to others. Both are true. The technology Ezekiel shared was not alien hardware, but a pattern of attention. The crystal was not a relic. It was a mirror. I still get waves of fear. I still lose sleep. When they come, I follow the same choreography: prepare the body, honor the wound, state the truth, hold the image, proceed with work. The practice does not remove the weather. It teaches me to build roofs. Mini cliffhanger. There is another doorway now, not to a different apartment, but to other people's rooms. What happens when I let this method out into the world without Ezekiel's light? Will the craft travel intact? Will it hold under strangers' hands? Loop affirmation, new I am the craftsman of my field. I convert hurt into habit. I keep the work small and honest. A returned phone call is light on the refrigerator door. A neighbor who keeps a word is a hinge. Money arrives in quiet rhythms, like a meter spinning at a steady pace rather than a lightning strike. The apartment is not an endpoint. It is a practice field. Sometimes at dusk, when the light reaches my living room at a certain angle, the shadow behind the bookshelf lengthens, and I swear I see a silhouette that remembers Ezekiel. It is only a shadow, and yet seeing it is like recognizing an old grammar in a sentence. I no longer startle. I look, and I am grateful. I do not expect luminous visits. I expect work. There are things I still do every morning. The ritual is not flashy. It is a set of small, engineered gestures that hold me steady. I sit. I breathe for 1 minute, slow and even. I touch a wound, one precise memory, and stay there until it yields a single sentence of learning. I write that sentence on a sticky note and fold it into a plan. I pick one measurable act for the day, a transfer to savings, a call to a client, an hour of focused work. I say a sentence aloud. The words are plain. The posture is steady. I call this practice my craft of stewardship. The phrase I say has shifted with time. It used to be raw, clumsy. Now it is a tool. Today I say, I steward arrival with clear hands. Later, before a meeting, I say, I align my promises with my ledger. At night, closing my eyes, I say, I translate hurt into habit. Each variation is a knot in a rope. Each repetition tightens the hold. When fear arrives, and it still does, I follow a choreography I learned under Ezekiel's light. I lower my shoulders. I soften my jaw. I name the fear softly. Like a child, I do not want to frighten. I am afraid of losing this stability. I breathe toward the place that tightens in my chest, and I let the breath dissolve the edges. Then I fold the fear into a plan. Small, honest, measurable. Today, that looks like a 3-month buffer, an updated invoice, a conversation with a contractor. The act of turning a feeling into a verb quiets the drama. I have not stopped being careful with words. Ezekiel taught me that language matters not as rhetoric, but as craft. I do not announce certainty to strangers. I do not sell hope as a product. I say what I can do, and I do it. In meetings, I bring budgets, timelines, tests. I let my ledger speak when faith would shout. This is humility, and it is also leverage. People notice competence more than sermon. Not everyone stayed. The edges of my life trimmed themselves by weather or choice. Some old friends fell away because the new me made different demands on time and attention. Christina drifted to a safer shore. Others, like Eduardo, softened in their own way. He still flinches at the word alien, but he no longer tries to pull me back into old maps. He eats my stale bread now and asks how I keep the habit going. He asks practical questions about transfers and calendars. That is his gift. I found ways to use what I learned that did not feel like preaching. A cousin asked me to look at a CV. I taught him the small habit. Name the wound. Extract one sentence of learning. Pick a measurable action. 2 weeks later, he had temporary work and a plan to scale. A neighbor brought over a bill and asked if I could help make a simple budget. We sat on the balcony with 2 pens and cheap tea. We turned grief into a timeline, then into steps. He paid a late notice. These are not miracles. They are nails hammered straight. At the office, my posture changed. Small projects that had once been scraping noise became repeatable flows. I asked for what I needed: a clearer brief, a realistic timeline, and I attached data to the request. When people accused me of being cold or calculating, I let the results answer. The work did. The crystal, for all its myth, never became a talisman. It is an anchor. When doubt sits heavy in my throat, I pick it up and feel the daily scaffolding beneath my hands. I place it in a small wooden box on my desk. The box is not an altar. It is a reminder that my authority comes from practice, not from objects. There were nights of relapse. There were mornings when panic unrolled like fog across my mind, and I forgot the sentences. On those days, the habit is not performance. It is a rescue. I do the breathing. I return to one wound, not to sink, but to excavate. I write the sentence, build a 3-month liquidity buffer. I do the act. It is mundane. It is deliberate. It accumulates. Sometimes, doing the mundane feels lonely. Sometimes the city yells that I have been lucky. Sometimes I sit at the table and listen to an old tape of shame. On those evenings, I talk to the room. I speak plainly. I have learned how to steward arrival. I do not speak in metaphors. I show the spreadsheet. I show the transfers. I show the tests and their results. Language with handles. The code I learned is practical and shaped by limits. It is not a doctrine. There are days I remind myself and others. Measure. Have counsel when suffering is clinical. Do not promise miracles. Do your craft. This is a rule I repeat internally like a charm. It keeps the work honest. There were small, undeniable proofs along the way. A client I had thought lost returned with payment in full. A neighbor offered to fix my balcony in exchange for lessons in photography. A one-off event job turned into a recurring contract. None of these events felt like thunderclaps. They were the sound of a house being built, nails and timber, one by one, until the frame stood. I began to see the world in patterns. People respond to readable signals. When you match a wound to a plan and a plan to an act, your life becomes legible. Clients, banks, friends, they prefer legible people. The trick is to convert interior calibration into external craft. That is the work of a maker. That is what I mean when I say I translate harm into habit. There are moral edges to this technology. Ezekiel's voice in those last evenings was patient and exacting. He said, "Do not weaponize lack as demand." I see what he meant when I watched the temptation in meetings, to present scarcity as drama to manipulate sympathy. I refuse that. Scarcity is not a tool to be wielded. It is a condition to be measured and managed. Integrity is the field's law. Honesty is the currency. Sometimes people ask me if I am selling the method. I smile and clarify. I am not a guru. I am a witness. I offer what I did. I show the steps. I am careful with language because the body of the work must remain an applied craft, not a doctrine. If someone tries the ritual and it helps, I am glad. If it does not, I say, measure what you can. Seek care when needed. The method is a set of verbs, not a promise. The biggest gift of the last months is this: autonomy. Ezekiel left the shape of a teacher and the practice of a craftsman. I can feel his absence as a presence of a different texture, less awe, more method. He asked that I practice without spectacle. He said the true test is sustaining the code when no light watches. I have discovered that the hardest audience is the ordinary day. I have also learned to look for the right signs. A punctual invoice, a contractor who honors a quote, a neighbor keeping a promise. These are signs. They are not miracles. They are the world rearranging itself to the steadiness of your demands. The crystal never promised fireworks. It promised an instrument. There is another doorway now. It is not another apartment. It is the threshold that opens when you decide to offer the practice to others without the alien light. What happens when I teach this craft to people who do not believe in luminous mentors? Will the pattern travel intact? Will it hold under different hands? I have begun to test that edge. I started with one person at a time. A young woman I met at a workshop said she felt stuck. She had a chronic health expense and no buffer. We sat on my couch with a pen. I taught the 4 acts. Honor the wound. Translate into one sentence. Pick a measurable act. Run a weekly test. She practiced for 2 months. She called me one rainy evening and said her credit card company had improved terms after she sent them a clear payment plan and evidence of transfers. The relief in her voice was small and precise. She paid down the balance. She told me later that the practice made shame legible and therefore manageable. That is the work traveling. Another example. A contractor I once barely trusted asked me to audit his cash flow. We found a habit of late invoicing, and we built a small ritual around invoicing. 3-minute morning check, one declarative sentence before sending, a follow-up cadence. His business steadied. He stopped sleeping with one eye open. These were pick one measurable step you can do in the next 24 hours. Do it. Record the result. That is the first 3-day experiment. Do it 7 times. Watch for pattern. When doubt whispers that this is superstition, I answer with data. I keep a small notebook of micro proofs. Invoices paid, calls returned, neighbors who help. I catalog them like a carpenter catalogs joints. Over time, the book speaks louder than any argument. There is an ethic in all this. Do not sell hope as certainty. Do not weaponize need. Keep the practice small, honest, repeatable. Teach by showing, not by preaching. Keep counsel with professionals when the wound is clinical. The epilogue of this journey is not a triumphant announcement. It is an ongoing apprenticeship with life. I do the work. I measure. I adjust. I steward what arrives. I keep the ritual simple so it can survive the days when I am tired. Sometimes, under the gray of late afternoon, I look up at the stars and sense other portals waiting, not promised, only hinted. If our traumas can be turned into tools, what other capacities lie dormant in routine? What else does the field expect of us if we learn its language? The question is a hinge. It opens toward practice. Before I close, I do a short breathing practice you can try wherever you are. Sit with your feet on the floor. Breathe in for 4 counts. Hold for 2. Breathe out for 6. Place a hand over the place in your chest that tightens when you think of a past hurt. Call the memory to mind for 30 seconds. Ask in a whisper, what did I learn that I can use? Wait for a sentence to come. Write that sentence down. Choose one small act you can do tomorrow that enacts that sentence. Do it. This is how a wound becomes a tool. My loop affirmations now are, I steward what arrives with honest hands. I convert hurt into usable plans. I keep my word to myself. Each is said in the morning and again before sleep. Each is a tiny ritual of accountability. There are variations I use when I need to steady courage. I am the maker of my measures. I do one honest test. I hold arrival as fragile and real. These sentences are not slogans. They are handles. I do not know whether Ezekiel lingers in some frequency beyond my sight. Maybe he is a shape of my own attention. Maybe he exists where he must. It does not matter. The work is mine now. The light taught me a grammar. I practice sentences that make the world readable. There is a door I keep unlocked. Some nights I still half expect a presence at the doorway. When nothing appears, I do not feel abandoned. I feel invited to stay at the bench and keep working. The real proof of the method is not in luminous visits, but in the steady cadence of ledgers, repaired relationships, and mornings where I breathe and know the next step. If you stayed with me to the end, thank you. If this story landed somewhere inside you, a question, a memory, a small ember of possibility, leave a comment with your city and country. Tell me one small act you can do tomorrow. Subscribe if you want to watch these experiments continue. Each subscriber helps this channel reach more people who need simple, honest methods. Your presence matters like a neighbor keeping a promise. I look at the crystal one last time. It is quiet. My thumb finds its edge. I whisper the loop. I steward what arrives with honest hands. I translate hurt into habit. I keep the work small and true. The light outside the window softens. A new portal waits, not promised, only invited. I step toward my work. Chamada Final. Thank you for staying with this story. If it touched you, share your city and one small action you'll take tomorrow in the comments. Subscribe to join this quiet experiment. Every new subscriber helps us reach 1,000 and keep the work moving. Peace to your morning.